Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. I am privileged and honored to interview Dr. Rick Reckman today, October 28th, 2016. You received your doctorate from the University of Cincinnati in June of 1977 and have spent the entirety of your multifaceted professional career in the state of Ohio. You've been on the board and served as the 1986 president of the Cincinnati Academy of Professional Psychology, in addition to participating on the board and serving as the Ohio Psychological Association's president from 1999 into the new millennium in 2000. You have been the president and CEO of Columbia Savings Bank, maintaining a private psychological practice from 1978 to the present. You've been adjunct faculty at Xavier Universities and University of Cincinnati's clinical psychology graduate programs, and a management consultant to a number of large corporations, as well as consulting to the American Psychological Association's practice directorate. And I believe that was regarding managing mental health care and mental health care delivery systems.
Yes.
You've donated your time and energy to the Wyoming City Public Schools on a number of committees and created a number of scholarly papers and presentations. You've also co-created and overseen the Union of Psychology and Spirituality Retreat for OPA for a number of years. Today, I would like to interview you in regard to your experience and observations of the evolution of the practice of psychology in Ohio, your practice of psychology, and the roles that OPA and APA have played in this evolution over the years. Now, I don't know, but perhaps a good place to begin would be with when you realized that psychology was your passion.
Gosh, I think that was my sophomore year of college, and I took a Psych 101 class, and it just clicked for me. I just liked it, and I had previously been going to be a history major, and then an English major, and then I thought about philosophy, although I got terrible grades in that. So. And then took a psychology class, and I really liked it, and I ended up meeting the faculty and establishing good relationships with a lot of the teachers in our department, and went straight from there to graduate school. So
nice. And at that time, what did the practice of psychology look like? What did you think you were entering into?
Well, I'm not sure that I knew it all when I was in college,
Okay.
and I was getting a taste of it certainly in graduate school at the University of Cincinnati. We started doing clinical interviews probably 30 days after we started. So right from the beginning, there were clinical placements and opportunities. So I was learning about the work, but in terms of sort of really practicing in the community, just sort of picked up pieces of that in graduate school and learned more about it once I got out of graduate school.
And so you started practicing in 77, and then when did things start to shift with managed care? And
well, I graduated in 1977, I was licensed in 78, and I worked in the community mental health system for 4 or 5 years, doing a little bit of private practice on the side. And then starting in 1982, I started doing more private practice, and then 1984 started working full-time in private practice. And those days were pretty wide open. Licensure had been established in Ohio, I believe, in 1970. There was legislation requiring insurance companies to pay psychologists for their work, which had not existed. I think that was passed about in 1987, if I remember correctly. So at that point, in those years, 84, 85, things were really pretty wide open, and psychologists were able to set their own rates. Very few restrictions of any kind on our practice, and it was just a question of sort of getting out in the world and establishing yourself and meeting enough people and developing referral sources to be busy. But it was very shortly after that that things started to change. And in Cincinnati, managed care was starting to emerge across the country. And the Physicians Association in Cincinnati decided to take a proactive stance with that and formed their own HMO, which was called Choice Care. And really got off to a very quick start. And within, say, 2 years, they were able to cover about a third of the Cincinnati market. And as a physician group, they did not include psychologists or any non-physician providers. So in fairly short order, anybody in Cincinnati who wished to come see me would be able to do that. To suddenly, in a year or two time, it was down to 2/3. So a third out, but
Yes.
2/3 could still come. And the larger insurance companies were also starting managed care plans, and they also initially were not including psychologists. So probably maybe 3 or 4, 5 years into my private practice career, over half the potential patients in town, there was no reimbursement for them to see psychologists. So they could come see me, but there was no insurance or third-party reimbursement. And that was really disturbing both for me and for other private practitioners in town. And that led, probably in '83 or '84, as this was starting, to the creation of the Cincinnati Academy of Professional Psychology. Psychologists, which was a local professional group of clinicians, practicing clinicians in the community. And so I joined that right away and was on the board within a year and was president about 2 years later. And our whole emphasis at that time was really on getting the doors open back up for the half potential clients in Cincinnati to be able to see psychologists again. And so we did some fundraising among the private practitioners, asked everybody who was involved in CAP, which is probably about 35 people at the time, maybe 40 people at that time, to contribute $1,000, which virtually everybody did. And we hired a public relations firm, and we started visiting Choice Care, visiting contacting the insurance companies that were starting managed care companies. We tried to make efforts through OPA on the legislature to see if we could do something with legislation around that, which was not forthcoming in any immediate way. I made a lot of trips with our public relations person to Choice Care in particular, because that was the big one in Cincinnati, but made them also to other large insurers. Most of those were actually on the phone because they weren't based in Cincinnati. And that we were successful, although it probably took, I'm no longer sure exactly how long it was, but 2 or 3 years for that to happen. And Choice Care did open up their provider panels to include psychologists, and then later I think chiropractors and some other non-physician groups over time. Now, so on one hand, that was a great victory because suddenly the vast majority of psychologists, the vast majority of patients could come see any psychologist that they chose or were on the panel, but it was a curse at the same time. And the curse was that the way managed care worked is they said, since by putting you on our panel, we will assure you of an adequate number of patients or as many patients as you want, but in return for that, you have to accept a lower payment. And that was the bargain. And at first, it was a smaller payment that was not too much lower. And then a couple years after that, the payment lowered again, and a couple years after that, the payments lowered again. And this was a pattern not just with Choice Care, but with the other large insurers who were doing managed care. And it became such that we were probably making, for on an hourly basis, 40% less than we had several years earlier when we started, and there was no negotiation of rates, and the panels were closed, so that new psychologists coming out of school and who wanted to practice privately, they weren't allowed on the panels. And so it was this sort of bargain with the devil, so to speak, that we could be busy, but only if we were accepting a really real low rate for our services. At the same time, there were social workers and counselors and other providers of mental health services that were knocking at the door trying to get themselves in. And the answer from the insurance companies when we approached them about more money was, take it or leave it, basically. And so there's a lot of pain and distress in the community over that,
Yes.
and a lot of frustration, and that really continued well into the 1990s, and longer somewhere. I mean, that basic model is still there. Most of the managed care panels have opened up over time, although that was probably not true for the first 10 years. And the rates have gone up somewhat, but sort of compared, if you adjust for inflation for what rates were, say, in 1985, they are below that today, sort of adjusted for inflation. So one of my focuses all along has been on some of the economic aspects of being a psychologist, and trying to do whatever we can about that. What I would say overall, though, is we have not been very successful with that. And the insurance companies look at private practitioners as individual people, and they don't really matter whether this person, that person leaves, or and there's always other people who are interested in getting on the panel so they can build their practice that are easily replaced. And psychologists are not allowed to bargain collectively, whereas the insurance companies, while they're not allowed to bargain collectively, there's only 5 or 6 of them, and they don't have to do that. So they can, and they're well aware of what each other pays, and so they're in a position where we have very little clout. Whereas on the other hand, places, Cincinnati, we have a children's hospital that is in the top 3 or 4 in the country. It's a huge institution, very prestigious, has a very large psychology department. I think there's about 75 clinicians, and there's others who are doing research. And Children's Hospital has negotiating power. So when a psychologist in Cincinnati goes sees a private practitioner, the insurance company will reimburse X number of dollars per, say, 50-minute session, 45 or 50-minute session. And Children's Hospital can charge significantly more, maybe 60% more, maybe even more than that at times. So the reimbursement rate, the insurance companies are willing to pay if they have to. In Cincinnati, you can't really say you cover people's lives unless you deal with all the children.
Right.
And Children's Hospital is so big, it's basically the whole market for children's, all the hospital services, but a lot of the other services as well. So they have bargaining power, and some large institutions have some bargaining power, and they get paid significantly more per hour. But we've never really been able to sort of break through that for the individual practitioner.
And around that time also, you were involved with OPA, and were you working with legislation? I know
as we sort of did that locally, we were well aware of what was happening faster in Cincinnati with the development of choice care. It was really clear to me that this is going to be happening not just in Cincinnati, but across the state and across the nation. We have a healthcare cost crisis that goes back 30 years, where the healthcare costs have been rising much faster than inflation.
Yes.
And it's been a system that's just, it's been a problem.
Yes.
And managed care is an attempt to solve that problem. And obviously that wasn't unique to Cincinnati. So we did contact OPA, and tried to interest them. We made a presentation at APA and tried to make the argument to them.
Wow.
The response at OPA was they weren't quite sure what to do with that, or they weren't quite sure that made sense. There was some logic to it, but they weren't really geared up to do that exactly. And so we were just sort of gently said, well, we'll think about it. And at the APA level, the practice director of the APA level had just started when we spoke with them.
Okay.
And I met with the first executive director of the practice directorate, and he had an interest in that.
Good.
And sort of, he understood the business aspects of that, and we did a project or two that I was involved in.
Mm-hmm.
That was really around trying to develop relationships with the national insurers and make sure the quality care was done and that reimbursement would be adequate for that. It involved half a dozen trips around the country to different places, but eventually really didn't go anywhere. So.
How frustrating.
Well, you know, it does surprise me that psychologists as a whole, as a large group, are not so interested in how much money they make. And maybe that's a good thing. You know, on one hand, I don't want to be sort of making every decision I do and how much money I can make. At the same time, by not being so interested in that, we've allowed ourselves to be paid, really be by far the lowest paid doctoral level profession in the country. And there's no reason for that.
No.
You know, it's one of the jokes that were made when we were talking to the physicians at Choice Care years ago was this, well, psychotherapy is not brain surgery.
Mm.
And I would say, yes, it's not brain surgery, and in many ways it's far more complicated and subtle than that. And
Yes.
you know, so if someone's
for you.
skill with a knife, and not to diminish, you
No.
know, I don't want somebody
No.
fooling around with my brain,
No.
but there's 100 variables that go into every session of psychotherapy, and if we're going to do good work, we have to be juggling a lot of things all at the same time, and it's not easy work. And there are people who are in tremendous distress, and sometimes our work is really taxing and difficult. Other times it's you know, a joy, it's fun, it's interesting, it's stimulating, but sometimes it's really hard, and over the course of a long day, it is taxing for almost everyone. So when I was on the OPA board, I think I was on the board for 12 or 15 years, and we would try to get to people in economic issues. We'd get a small response. Clinical training, of course, anything that was frightening to psychologists, like changes with HIPAA or ethical things, go pack the room when people were concerned this and how they might do something wrong. But when we talked about try to have what we could do to sort of earn more money for what we do, truly a minimal response. So it's been something that I had an interest in, but
Yeah.
it's not really mainstream for psychologists.
Well, and it's fascinating as I'm listening to you to realize that we as psychologists really haven't made that connection with how money, as well as the level of degree, kind of validates.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
It's a shame. And I'm curious, when you were working with the practice directorate at APA, was that the time when you said they were working with national insurers? Was that Medicaid, Medicare?
Oh, no. Well, APA is always working with Medicare and Medicaid, the federal programs. There's a portion of the practice director that's lobby-based, and their number one focus really is always Medicare.
Okay.
So that's existed
Okay.
probably as long as there's been Medicare, which goes back, I think, to 65.
Okay.
What I was talking about really is dealing with private insurers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I realize when I've been to state leadership, we continue as psychologists to have our psychologists entered into the physician definition.
Yes.
So that we can be covered. And
Yes.
so somewhere along the line we weren't interfacing very well with that system and
Yes.
and missed a big boat there as
Yeah,
well.
we were one of the last ones in, and I don't know the whole story of that other than just to say we weren't effective from the beginning in '65 and in the '70s in terms of psychologist services being recognized by in Medicare and Medicaid, and we are in place now, but it took an extraordinarily long time.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's direct lobbying with the federal government and with Congress.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned that how stressful and difficult and how amazing working with our clients and patients can be. And I wonder if there has been a type of work that you've done, because you've done a variety of consulting and psychotherapy and things like that, and a variety of populations you've worked with. Is there any that's really just inspired you more than another?
I'd say a couple different things. One is that when I was senior in college, I took a meditation class and started a daily meditation practice, which I'm now 65 years old, so for 43 years now I've meditated daily. And out of that, learned a lot about sort of quieting the body, quieting the mind. And so early on in my practice, I encountered people with panic disorder and other sort of anxiety disorders, and thought right away, well, this is the opposite of meditation. So developed an approach of working with people around using meditation approaches to sort of respond both to acute panic episode, but also what I call sort of lower the anxiety baseline over time. And I've probably seen 1,000 clients using that methodology since 1978 or 1979, so over a very long period of time. And it's been very gratifying because people with panic disorder come in great distress. They feel like they're losing their mind, they're out of control, and in this course normally of say 4 to 6 weeks, they can reverse the surge of panic, and that the whole fear of being out of control and overwhelmed goes away once they are able to do that. And so we get people who are sort of in acute distress, and then it's gone. And I wish that was the case with marriage counseling and depression and all the other things I do.
Stress just melts away.
Yeah, so that's been a very rewarding aspect of my work.
And again, you were before the cutting edge, the front end of that, because it seems like it's really gotten legs.
Yeah, well, the meditation
in the public eye.
Has
more
sort of
recently.
grown slowly over time, and then the
Yes.
mindfulness emphasis has been the last 15 or 20 years has been something that's sort of gone like that. And I just sort of stumbled into that in college and took an interest in that, and it helped me enormously in terms of managing my stress. And I went from being a pretty hyper type A person to being pretty relaxed and more laid back, at least most of the time, not all the time, but that's been 40 years of repetition. So
Yes.
yeah.
And what made you decide to bring that to psychologists in Ohio through the Union of Psychology and Spirituality Conference?
Well,
How did that even-
I think through my meditation, and I'd done a lot of reading about sort of Buddhist psychology in the late 1990s, and just my interest in sort of how the mind works, what is consciousness, what's reality, to what extent do we construct things, which in my mind is 99% of it. And so all of that appealed to me. And when I finished up my term as the president of OPA in 2000, I thought, so what do I want to do? You know, there's a privilege that comes with being the OPA president, which is that you can sort of ask for things, and if they're not unreasonable, you'll get them. And so I think in 2004, 2005, I have another spiritual practice which I do, which is sit down in the morning, not every morning anymore, but pad of paper, I write 3 pages as fast as I can.
Wow.
And you see what emerges. And what emerged for me one day was just writing about what might I do with sort of the credibility I have from OPA, and out of that 3 pages came an outline of a conference to talk about where psychology and spirituality, where they overlap, and how they, and in my view, we go through adult stages of development, psychological, and then at some point we have to sort of move beyond ourselves into something larger or greater. And I get that model from Ken Wilber. And so I thought many psychologists are really uncomfortable talking about religion in any way, talking about spirituality in any way. We emphasize the science aspects of things, which I think is all well and good, but it's not the whole picture. And so I thought I wanted to create an opportunity for psychologists who were interested in that to talk about where spirituality comes into play in terms of human development and experience, and to help psychologists be able to talk with their clients about their clients' faith and religion, because for the vast majority of people, that's an important aspect of their lives. And if we just sort of stay away from it, then we're avoiding an important part of the meaning in many people's lives.
Yes.
So I wanted to sort of open and free up the conversation about where psychology and spirituality come together. And so I think I'm here today for, I think our 11th or 12th OPA Union of Psychology and Spirituality retreats. So.
That is fantastic. And people who I've spoken with who have attended this conference or this retreat have just been so enthused and so thankful to have something like this,
yeah.
To be able to think about things a little differently and experience things, take the time to experience things.
Well, we've had a really good response in terms of people's interest and welcoming the opportunity to talk about these things. It's not the mainstream. I mean, I think the most we've ever had come was last year we had 46 or 47 attendees. We've had as few as 20. And I think there's, how many members of OPA?
Oh,
over 1,000?
Maybe 3,000. I'm
No,
not.
not
I
that
may
many
be
members,
thinking.
but there's at least 3,000 psychologists in Ohio.
That's
maybe
right.
4,000.
That's right.
And so, we're not drawing a huge percentage of the psychologists, but
Probably a third.
The ones that do come here, they like it. And my approach to learning is, particularly with professionals, is not to stand up and lecture for 3 hours at a time. And when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about clinical work and how to integrate the two of them. For me or for anybody else to stand up and lecture and tell people how to do that, there's a limit on how much people want to hear.
Yeah.
And when we have a room full of people that do this very thing themselves at some level, we're going to learn as much by sort of sharing. So in our retreats, we spend no more than a quarter of the time with lecture, and we have a lot of participation, a lot of dialogue, and some different experiential things that we do together.
That is fantastic. Have there been any stories coming out of your experience over these 11 years with the retreats that you'd like to share?
Well, we've had some pretty intense experiences in the retreats.
I bet, yeah.
And they get to be a little hard to describe,
Uh-huh.
but I think people are just very pleased, the psychologists that come are just very pleased to be able to speak openly about their work. We, of course, try to create an atmosphere of sort of wide acceptance and openness to one another, and people find that really refreshing. And typically over the course of the 2 days that we meet, people sort of get more and more open and more comfortable, and my hope out of all this is we would sort of develop a community of people that would stay in touch with each other and sort of continue to sort of grow this over time, and that's been my experience.
That is wonderful, yeah. Are there any ways that the different regional groups in Ohio can help promote this or expand the community that you're creating here?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because I as you're talking, even though I've been involved with OPA, I know that there are people who practice in Cleveland who either aren't aware of this or haven't thought about it, that I think it is also similar to what they practice, and they would be really enthused about having a community of support and knowledge. And
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah, it's just a question how to reach them, I guess.
That's
And
right.
then can
Well,
they free up the time for 2 days to come?
Yeah. Well, you
Meet
certainly
somewhere.
make it appealing enough that I think that's not the issue. I think people really enjoy coming, and it's pretty important, I think, to take the time. And we don't often have time
Yeah, no,
anymore.
We live in a culture that's just busier and busier and busier. And I heard a report on NPR sometime in the last 2 weeks that the average smartphone user checks their phone 150 times a day.
Oh my goodness.
And if I think of waking hours as 16 hours, and I'll cheat and call that 15, that's 10 times a day, 10 times an hour.
Wow.
So the average smartphone user is checking their phone every 6 minutes. And I don't know how people focus and get things done just
Right.
looking. And mindfulness and meditation really are about developing sustained concentration and about being able to direct one's attention and to stay with things for significant periods of time and focus on what's really there and really happening. And it's sort of the opposite and maybe a balancing thing to the electronic culture. And smartphones are wonderful in lots of ways. They can help you find places or stay in touch, learn things quickly. But they're really taking us the opposite direction of what I value the most, which is really being able to stay focused and concentrate well and listen well and engage fully.
Yeah.
And if I'm checking my phone every 6 minutes, I'm not sure how fully I can be engaged.
Yeah. Yeah. Barely gives you enough time to breathe. Well, is there anything else from your practice? Because I think that the oral history interviews will be viewed by both people who have known you and would like to see what you have to say, but also young people who are considering entering the practice of psychology. I think you've been involved and supported the practice of psychology through some really difficult developmental transitions.
Well, I do have the privilege of teaching at Xavier University for the graduate students, and so I teach an ethics class at the end of their first year, and then I've taught a positive psychology class that for many of them is their last class they take before getting their doctorate.
Nice.
And I think it's still a wonderful field, and the faster things go, to me, the more we're going to be needed.
Absolutely.
And what I say to the students is there's really an unlimited demand for our services. You know, if we start applying them beyond straight problem solving with clinical populations, we could use 30 times the psychologists that are around if we're designing environments that are welcoming and open and encourage interaction, engagement. So to me, there's a truly unlimited potential for psychologists and doing interesting things.
Yes.
The issue is sort of how to get paid for that,
Yeah.
and how sort of earn a living, and the clinical practice within the healthcare system in some ways is the easiest thing to do because it's an established system and you sort of plug into something that's there. And there's always been these predictions that private practice was going to shrink and there was going to be, well, there's a lot of psychologists now practicing in hospitals and in physician offices, and the idea was somehow that the number of clinicians in private practices was going to. And I've been in practice now for 35 years, and I have more demand than ever. And it's not just for me personally,
Yes.
but everybody I know.
Yeah.
In the office I practice in, there's 8 other clinicians, and the psychologists that I know in the community, all of us have more work than we can do. And so, yes, there are more psychologists than ever. There's more working in hospitals and in physician practices where a lot of our referrals come from. But interestingly, what I think about in terms of maintaining my practice, I see 35 to 40 people a week, is that I would add maybe 2 new people a week to sort of maintain that.
Uh-huh.
And I probably get 2 new referrals a day.
Wow.
So I sort of have to pick and choose, which is just kind of tough to do.
Yes.
And when I talk to people and they call, they say, oh, I've talked to other psychologists, they can't take me, can you take me? And it's not just that I'm particularly busy, I think the demand has just continued to grow.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so I think there's going to be lots of jobs for psychologists for a long time to come, and it's just a question of sort of how do we structure that. I talk with the graduate students that professions are growing things. They're things that develop over time. They're not a fixed, this is what a psychologist is, or this is what a lawyer is, or a plumber is. What we do changes over time, and where we do it and how we do it changes over time. So I think there's going to be unlimited possibilities for psychologists. And what I say to the students is the biggest restriction is the restrictions we put on ourselves and our own thinking. But so there's many opportunities for psychologists.
Oh, that's very exciting. And in part of what you were talking about, you mentioned that there are areas where psychologists can be very useful that we're not doing a lot in. And you have done some consulting to major corporations. And so in that respect, would you see that as...
Yeah, again, the challenge is how to get plugged into that. But there are many people in business who are interested in doing very well in their careers. They're very achievement focused, and there's a lot of skills they have to learn to do that are business skills. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, they are interpersonal issues, and sort of how they manage themselves and how they manage conflict and how they deal with all the people aspects that come up in any business. Mm-hmm. And so they call that coaching. They call it executive coaching. Mm-hmm. And the beauty of that is usually companies pay for that, and you can charge significantly more than we make as clinicians. The issue is how do you get yourself out there so people know you, and how do you believe that you've got something to offer them that's worth $250 an hour. Yeah. Or whatever it is that you're charging. So that's just one thing that's out there. There's a lot of organizational consultation that goes on that's done by psychologists. And, that is an established field, but it's really one that we underplay, and there's many more opportunities than we ever are sort of aware of or know how to pursue.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And I hope that... I'm glad that you're saying this to your students at Xavier, and I also hope that more young people tap into these interviews to hear this encouragement and to hear that this is an exciting, vibrant field, because that's certainly been my experience, and you've experienced a lot of it. So fantastic.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you,
and
Kathy.
everything you've done. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Uh-huh.